Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at tone questions, or questions on tone. But before we can dive into questions and answers in the National 5 Close Reading on tone, we need to ask this really important question. What is tone? It's one of those words that's used in a lot of different contexts. So, for example, one way in which tone is used is you might hear it in your art classroom. We can talk about like warm tones. So the reds and the oranges and the pinks in this picture are warm, and then the blues are cold tones. Here's an example of someone painting with different shades, different tones of blue. And as I said, I'm not an artist, so in this picture there's lots of different tones, but I struggle to identify them, which is the problem that people have with the close reading. They struggle to identify tones in writing. So whereas you might be really good at art and you could talk to me about these tones that I don't understand, in this video I'm going to try and flip that so that you're confident talking about the tones in the writing that we read, in the articles that we read. Now, another way that we talk about tone is in music. We talk about the tone of a piece, and again, my understanding is quite limited here. Those of you who are musicians or enjoy your music classes with your teacher will probably be able to tell me more about tones in music. Then there's tone of voice. Now, we can all talk about tones of voice because we're all experts at this. Our ears are finely tuned to pick up on the tone that people use when they speak to you, or when you're listening to people speaking. So you might have an affectionate tone, something like, "Oh, look at the cute puppy, he's so cute." Okay, that's quite affectionate. A humorous tone, "Oh, look, he's after falling off the sofa and landing in his water." Okay, so something mildly funny. You might have a cautious tone. "Oh, I don't know, that mountain looks quite high. I don't think we should really climb it." What about enthusiastic? "Oh, come on, be brave. We can definitely make it to the top of this mountain. We've practiced and practiced and practiced." That's an enthusiastic tone of voice. Then we all know the sarcastic tone of voice. I'm not going to do an impression of that, but no one likes to be talked to in a sarcastic tone of voice. A critical tone of voice. So maybe someone at home has said to you, "You really need to start cleaning your bedroom more often." Okay, critical tone of voice. Angry tone of voice. "I told you a dozen times, and I'm now losing the rag. It's time for you to clean your bedroom." Right? Angry tone of voice. A solemn tone of voice. That's if you've ever been to a funeral or a similar situation. People tend to speak in solemn tones, where try not to have much emotion in their voice at all. Try to be nice and calm. Now, all of these are tones of voice, but I'll show you later. These can be tones in writing as well that we'll look at. Now, caution. All right, a word of warning. Do not use these two words when talking about tone. The writer uses a positive tone to, or the writer uses a negative tone to. Simple reason is they're not accurate enough. The writer uses a positive tone or the writer uses a negative tone to are not accurate enough to describe the tone, and I'll show you why. They're umbrella terms again. All right, a positive tone, enthusiastic is positive, but so is praising, but they're very different. Humorous is positive, encouraging is positive, but they're all so different from each other that by saying a positive tone, you're not differentiating between them. You're not being specific enough. Likewise, if I said a negative tone, critical, angry, cautious, mocking, all of those are negative. But a cautious tone is nothing like a mocking tone, and again, which is not really like a critical tone. So we don't use the phrase the writer uses a positive tone, and we don't use the phrase a writer uses a negative tone. We have to be more specific and name and identify those words. Okay, here's the problem we come up against. So we talked about tones in art, we talked about tones in music, and we talked about tones of voice. And I think tone of voice, for me anyways, where I'd be most confident in those three. Now we get to this, we get to a page of writing, and you get asked about the writer's tone. What do we mean by that? Well, the writer's tone is their attitude to whatever they're describing. So they might be mocking of something. So they might be describing something that they're not happy about, something in politics. They might mock a politician. And their attitude towards the political policy or the politician will be mocking. They might be critical of the same politician. Or it might be a humorous tone, a light-hearted piece, talking about something that's kind of funny. It might be an angry tone if the writer's writing about something that really gets their blood boiling. Now, it's tricky for us because how do we see that tone? Because the writer doesn't read it out to us, so we can't hear it in their voice. So we have to look for some other way. And the answer to this is techniques. Now, it's time for a mini hot take here. The tone question trips far too many people up because they don't understand the next point. If you understand the next point, you'll fly through tone questions. Okay? A tone question is really a techniques question in disguise. I'm going to repeat that because it's so important. A tone question is really a techniques question in disguise. What do I mean by that? Well, you can discuss any technique to answer a tone question. Okay? In fact, you may not even have to name the tone because it could be given to you. It's all about the techniques. So you could talk about word choice as a technique to discuss a tone. You could talk about repetition. That's from sentence structure to talk about the tone. Parenthesis, something else from sentence structure, a technique that you can use to talk about tone. A rhetorical question you could use to talk about tone. Really, any technique that you have studied in this course for close reading, you can use to show that you understand how the tone is created, because that's what the writer uses. Because for our tone of voice, we can change our voice. But for a writer, all they can do is change their techniques and kind of manipulate the reader by using those techniques. So let's have a look at some examples. Okay, all those 8 tones that we looked at for tone of voice can similarly be tones for writing. And there are many more than just those 8. So please don't assume that these are the 8. There are hundreds of tones. Realistically though, there's probably only 10 or 15 that they would ask you in National 5 Close Reading. And here are some of the more common ones. And I mentioned mocking as well was one of the tones earlier as well. So on to the examples. We're looking at the tone here, talking about a royal wedding. So the royal wedding is set to cost a fortune. Taxpayers will have to fork out for security, sniffer dogs, anti-vehicle barriers and police overtime. It's expected to cost over £2 million. Shouldn't we be spending the money on helping the homeless and those using food banks? Many argue that the money brought in by tourists will easily pay for the security bill. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a subtle shift in tone there. Most of that passage is sort of against how much the royal wedding is going to cost. But the last line switches to a more positive tone, to a tone that is kind of appeasing, a tone that's praising how many tourists will be brought in as a result of the royal wedding. So there's a shift in tone in that passage. Now, the question is only going to ask us about the first tone. Here we go. In lines 1 to 7, so it doesn't go all the way to the bottom of the passage, the writer tries to achieve a critical tone. Explain with reference to her use of language how successful she has been at achieving this tone for 2 marks. Now, the great thing about National 5 is that they tell you the tone, or they have so far anyway. They could change their mind, but so far, since 2014, there haven't been many tone questions, but when there are, they tell you the tone. So in this case, we're told it's a critical tone, so we don't have to guess, okay, which is nice. Now, but what we do have to do is go and figure out how is that tone created. So let's go back to the passage. Okay, so there's our passage again. We're looking at the first 7 lines. We're ignoring the last sentence because the tone switches in that sentence. And we look, my first one here is fortune, right? The royal wedding is set to cost a fortune. Ask yourself, what technique is that? It's word choice, isn't it? Yeah, so they could have just said to cost a lot, or they could have put a price on it, but in this case they've said a fortune. Okay, let's look at another technique. Fork out. What technique is that? Well, that could be word choice, but I'm going to look at it as imagery. Okay, I'm going to look at it as a metaphor, but you'd be fine to look at that as word choice either. Any more techniques you can see? Have a scan down through the next sentence or 2. I can see 2 more techniques. Okay, and the first one here is a list. Okay, there's 3 items separated by commas and the word and. So we get a list: security, sniffer dogs, anti-vehicle barriers and police overtime. Sorry, 4 items. And anyone see the last technique? The last technique is a question, a rhetorical question in this case because there's no answer given. Okay, so we can have a look at any of those 4 techniques. Remember, it's a 2-mark question. There's our question for 2 marks. If we correctly identify one of those techniques and analyze it to show how it makes a critical tone, then we'll get full marks. So let's do that. Okay, let's look at the list to begin with. Okay, I'm not going to look at them all, so I've skipped fortune. I'm just going to go to the list for my first example. Okay, and it works like this. The writer uses a list in lines 2 to 4, and I quote the list so that I'm very clear which section of the text I'm looking at for my answer. And now, how does that list make it critical? Right? Why is the writer, their attitude to what they're writing about, critical here, negative? So it's negative because that list is used to emphasize the large number of expensive security actions that the public have to pay for. This shows that the writer disapproves of the cost of the royal wedding. So we're looking at expense, but the word I want to draw your attention to here, my answer, is this word disapproves. Okay, I put it in bold in this instance. So that shows my awareness of what critical means. That kind of links up to my nice analysis before about it being expensive, and that guarantees I get the second mark. So I get 1 mark for saying it's a list, and I get a second mark for showing how the list is disapproving, which links to the idea of being a critical tone. Okay, example 2. In lines 1 to, so same question again, okay, critical tone, but this time we're not going to look at the list. This time we're going to look at this image. Now, I could do it as word choice, the words fork out, meaning, and suggest, but I'm actually going to look at it as an image, as a metaphor. So I'm going to use just as and so too, because that's the formula we always use. And I need in my analysis to get across the idea how this is a critical tone. So let's look at what are we talking about? Forking out, right? This is the idea of paying money. Okay, now I have never paid for money with a fork. I've never put a fork into my wallet and taken out a few fivers or some pound coins to pay for anything, right? I use a fork for my dinner. Or you may have seen forks used in rural areas and farming, for example. Okay, so a fork on a farm is quite big, much bigger obviously than your kitchen fork, and it's used to quickly move things like hay and straw around. Okay, so when you're forking something across, there's the fork on the left hand side of the picture, and you get this big bundle of hay or straw that's left afterwards. Now you can imagine for the image that that's actually a pile of money, because that's what they're talking about. When you fork over, you're piling up money on top of money on top of money. It's the idea that it's costing lots and lots of money, that essentially you're going to need a huge pile of money to pay for all the security. And that's how the image works. It wants us to think of that image of the fork moving that amount of a pile of money. So how does that look in practice in the answer? So the writer uses a metaphor in line, oh, I forgot to put the line number. Doesn't matter because we've quoted, so we'll still get the mark, fork out. And I use my just as and so too. Just as forking something like hay means to move large amounts of something quickly without being too careful or accurate, so too the public are going to have to spend large amounts of money on keeping everybody safe at the wedding. This shows that the writer disapproves of the cost of the royal wedding. Now, if I go down here and grab my pen, I just want to show you we've used the just as and so too from the imagery section. So if you've started to look at this tone and you haven't yet looked at the imagery section of the course, if you go back to that section, it will explain how to answer this type of question. Also, if you go to the sentence structure section, you'll see how to answer the list that I did in the previous example. So we use the imagery formula, just as and so too, and we link it to this idea of disapproval. And that's how you answer a tone question. Now, I'm highlighting disapproves again because I use that word to show that I understood what critical means. Now, remember, at National 5 level, you're usually, now I stress usually, told the tone in a specific tone question. So that'll be a question for 2 marks saying, the writer uses this tone, show how they do it. So far at National 5, they haven't asked you to identify the tone. Now the SQA could change their mind next year, right? In May they could ask you, identify the tone used in lines 4 to 5. In that case, you would just go back to your list, of a praising tone, a mocking tone, a critical tone, an angry tone, a humorous tone, a cautious tone, and try to see what kind of tone that they're using. Okay, but so far they haven't asked us to do that. They're literally asking you to look at the tone that they give you, that they name, and then go and look at the techniques. So if you aren't told, you must identify the tone, as I've just said, cautious or angry or humorous. But so far you haven't been asked. So the formula that we use for this is identify the technique used by the writer, so a list or a word choice, a simile or a metaphor, any of the techniques that we've looked at in the course so far, and then explain how that example reveals the tone. Okay, so show how that technique, how that example reveals the critical tone, or the humorous tone, or the cautious tone, or the mocking tone, or the sarcastic tone. So focus on whatever the tone is that you're given in the question. So hopefully that's cleared up tone for us. It's a tricky word because it's used in so many aspects of our lives: art, music, writing. And for writing, we can start with tone of voice, but then realize that it's the techniques. The writers use techniques to get their tone across, and tone is their attitude to what they're writing about. It's how they feel about the thing that they're writing about. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Do they think it's a good idea? Do they think it's a bad idea? And that's the tone of their writing piece. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.